Benito Mussolini had one of the craziest ends of all time. In 1943, he was removed from power by his own government and arrested. But Germany rescued him and set him up as the puppet leader of a small region in northern Italy called the Republic of Salo. By 1945, however, Italian partisans, the resistance fighters supported by the Allies, were pushing north, and the collapse of the Salo Republic was inevitable. Mussolini and his mistress, Clara Petacci, tried to secretly escape into Switzerland. Their plan was to catch a plane to Spain, where Francisco Franco, the fascist dictator, was still in power. Just 2 days later, near Lake Como, their convoy was stopped by communist partisans named Valerio and Bellini. Mussolini was quickly identified by the political commissar Urbano Lazzaro. According to a previously signed agreement, Mussolini should have been handed over to the Allies. But instead, the next day, both Mussolini and Petacci were executed. The shootings took place in the small village of Giulino di Mezzegra, carried out by a partisan leader whose true identity is still uncertain, though most believe it was Walter Audizio. On April 29, 1945, their bodies were loaded into a van and taken south to Milan. There, they were dumped on the ground in Piazzale Loreto. After being kicked and spat upon, the corpses were hung upside down from the roof of a service station. From below, furious civilians hurled stones at them. It was a brutal end, and a symbolic one. Mussolini, once the dictator of Italy, reduced to a spectacle of public rage and humiliation. Nicolae Ceaușescu. The government in Romania was one of the most repressive in the Eastern Bloc, but in 1989, it met a brutal end. The Romanian Revolution, an uprising by the people against the communist regime, was underway. The final spark came on December 17th, when police and military forces opened fire on an anti-government protest. By December 20th, even though the press was fully censored, word spread through whispers and foreign anti-communist radio broadcasts. In response, Ceaușescu held a massive rally the very next day, in what is now known as Revolution Square. At first, it seemed like just another of his staged speeches. He blamed the unrest on so-called fascist agitators, who, in his words, were trying to destroy socialism. But Ceaușescu had misread the mood. Barely 8 minutes into his speech, people began booing and shouting. He tried to restore order by raising his right hand. For a moment, calm returned, but it didn't last. The crowd grew more defiant. Ceaușescu was forced to retreat inside the building as Bucharest erupted into open revolt. That night, the military filled the streets, arresting hundreds. By the next morning, the rebellion had spread to nearly every major city. His defense minister, believing he had been betrayed, took his own life. Almost all of the soldiers switched sides and joined the revolution. Ceaușescu made one last desperate attempt to address the masses from the balcony of the Central Committee building, but the people hurled stones and debris at him, forcing him to flee once again. With his wife, Elena, he escaped to the roof and boarded a helicopter, just seconds before demonstrators stormed the top floors. But their escape didn't last. The army had restricted all air traffic, and the helicopter was ordered to land. Soon after, Ceaușescu and his wife were detained by police, who ironically listened to updates about the revolution on the radio. On Christmas Day, December 25, 1989, the Ceaușescus faced a swift military trial. Nicolae Ceaușescu denied the court's authority, insisting he was still the rightful president of Romania. It made no difference. The couple was sentenced to death. Moments later, they were executed by firing squad, struck by more than 100 bullets in just seconds. Hideki Tojo. Hideki Tojo, the Japanese prime minister during World War II, met a grim and terrible end. After Japan's unconditional surrender in 1945, General Douglas MacArthur ordered the arrest of 40 high-ranking individuals accused of war crimes, and Tojo was at the top of that list. On September 11th, 5 American soldiers surrounded his home. Rather than surrender, Tojo attempted to take his own life, shooting himself in the chest with a pistol. But he missed his heart. As he bled heavily, Tojo began to speak, and 2 Japanese reporters recorded his final words. He said, "I am very sorry it is taking me so long to die. The Greater East Asia War was justified and righteous. I am deeply sorry for the nation and for all the races of the greater Asiatic powers. I wait for the judgment of history. I wish to end my life, but sometimes even that fails." The American soldiers managed to save him. He was rushed to a hospital, resuscitated, and later imprisoned in Sugamo Prison in Tokyo. There, he faced trial before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. He was found guilty of multiple war crimes. His sentence was death. On December 23, 1948, just 1 week before his 64th birthday, Hideki Tojo was executed by hanging. In his final statement, he expressed regret for the atrocities committed by the Japanese military. He urged the American authorities to show compassion toward the Japanese people, who had endured not only devastating air raids, but also the horrors of 2 atomic bombings. Kim Jong-il. In the late 2000s, rumors about Kim Jong-il's health spread like wildfire. Some reports even claimed he had already died years earlier and was secretly being replaced by body doubles. His absence from major public events, like the 2008 Olympic torch relay in Pyongyang, only fueled those theories. In September of that same year, Kim missed a huge military parade, and U.S. intelligence believed he might have suffered a stroke. North Korean media remained silent, but behind the scenes, things appeared serious. Japanese and South Korean sources suggested he had collapsed, was partially paralyzed, and was receiving treatment from foreign doctors. At one point, Pyongyang even ordered all of its diplomats abroad to remain close to their embassies in case urgent instructions arrived. Despite the speculation, North Korea released photographs and videos showing Kim in seemingly good health. Analysts, however, were skeptical. Some reports claimed he had suffered a second stroke. Even so, he managed to cling to power, reappearing in public, and even making foreign visits in 2010 and 2011 to countries like China and Russia. On several occasions, he was seen with his youngest son, Kim Jong-un, which made many believe he was grooming him to take over. Then, on December 17, 2011, North Korean state media announced that Kim Jong-il had died of a suspected heart attack while traveling by train. The news was accompanied by dramatic claims that a snowstorm suddenly stopped, the sky glowed red above Mount Paektu, and the ice on a sacred lake cracked with a thunderous roar that shook heaven and earth. In the aftermath, Kim Jong-il was declared North Korea's eternal leader, a title he still holds to this day. Joseph Stalin. In his later years, Joseph Stalin's health declined sharply. By 1950 and again in 1951, he was so unwell that he spent nearly 5 months on holiday at his Abkhazian Dhaka. Just as he had treated his political allies, Stalin showed deep paranoia toward his doctors, often refusing to trust them. In January 1952, he even had one physician imprisoned simply for suggesting that he retire to preserve his health. That same year, he launched the infamous Doctors' Plot, accusing prominent doctors of conspiring to assassinate top Soviet leaders. On the night of March 1, 1953, Stalin's staff discovered him lying semi-conscious on the floor of his bedroom at the Kuntsevo Dhaka. He was moved onto a couch, where he remained for 3 days. During this time, he was hand-fed with a spoon and given various medicines and injections. None of it helped. His condition worsened steadily, until, on March 5th, he finally died. The autopsy revealed that Stalin had suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage, and his brain arteries had been severely damaged by atherosclerosis, a disease that weakens and hardens blood vessels. When his body was put on public display, the crowds that gathered were so large and chaotic that a deadly crush occurred, killing many mourners. Even so, Stalin's death was not free from suspicion. Whispers quickly spread that he might have been poisoned or deliberately left to die by members of his own inner circle, most notably Lavrenti Beria, the feared head of the Soviet secret police, Pol Pot. By the late 1990s, things were collapsing for Pol Pot, the man behind Cambodia's brutal regime. In June 1997, he ordered the assassination of his longtime comrade Son Sen, along with 13 members of Sen's family and aides. Pol Pot later claimed he hadn't authorized all of those killings, but by then, trust inside the Khmer Rouge had completely disintegrated. One of the group's top commanders, Tamok, suspected that he might be the next target on Pol Pot's list. So he struck first. Rallying his loyal troops, Tamok accused Pol Pot of betraying their cause and forced him to flee. By this point, Pol Pot was so frail he had to be carried, and he didn't make it far. Tamok's forces captured him and placed him under house arrest. While confined, Pol Pot granted his final interview to American journalist Nate Thayer. He insisted that his conscience was clear, claiming he had acted for the good of his country and not for personal power. He even downplayed the genocide, arguing that the death toll of millions was exaggerated. In July of that year, Khmer Rouge leaders held a major meeting where they publicly sentenced Pol Pot to life imprisonment. But just months later, on April 15, 1998, he was dead. Official reports said he died in his sleep from a heart attack. Yet those present believed otherwise. They claimed Pol Pot had taken his own life with a mixture of Valium and chloroquine, right after hearing that Tamac intended to hand him over to the United States, Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein's downfall began after President George W. Bush accused him of possessing weapons of mass destruction. In 2003, Iraq was invaded by a U.S.-led coalition. Within just 3 weeks, the Iraqi government and military collapsed, and by early April, much of the country was under coalition control. When Baghdad fell on April 9th, marked by the dramatic toppling of Saddam's statue, he was nowhere to be found. His regime had been completely overthrown. To track down remaining officials, the U.S. military released the now famous Most Wanted Iraqi playing cards, placing Saddam as the ace of spades and his sons on other high-ranking cards. Bounties were also announced. $25 million for Saddam and $15 million for each of his sons. For months, he remained in hiding until December, when American troops searched a small farm. A soldier noticed a rope buried near a hut, which revealed a styrofoam-covered trapdoor. Beneath it was a narrow spider hole. Saddam Hussein emerged and surrendered, reportedly saying, "My name is Saddam Hussein. I am the president of Iraq, and I want to negotiate." He was taken into custody and held at U.S. military bases until November 5, 2006, when he was found guilty of crimes against humanity. The court sentenced him to death by hanging. Saddam requested execution by firing squad, claiming it was more fitting for a head of state and commander-in-chief, but his request was denied. On December 30, 2006, Saddam Hussein was executed by hanging. Footage of his death soon leaked online, captured in secret on a smuggled cell phone, and it spread across the world within hours. Francisco Franco. By the 1970s, Francisco Franco, Spain's long-ruling dictator, was clearly nearing the end of his life. He had already begun preparing for what came after him, formally naming Prince Juan Carlos as his successor back in 1969. Following a long illness, Franco finally died on November 20th, 1975, at the age of 82. The date carried heavy symbolism. It was the 39th anniversary of the death of José Antonio Primo de Rivera, the founder of Spain's fascist Falange movement. Some even claim Franco may have actually died the evening before, on the 19th, but the official announcement came a day later. Soon after, Juan Carlos was proclaimed King of Spain, beginning the country's gradual transition away from dictatorship and toward democracy. Decades later, Franco's shadow still lingered. In 2019, more than 40 years after his funeral, Spain's socialist government ordered his exhumation. The reasoning was that the Valley of the Fallen, where he had been buried, should be reserved for victims of the Civil War, and keeping Franco there was seen as an insult to their memory. His family opposed the decision, but the government moved his remains to Mingarubio Cemetery in El Pardo. Since the use of the Spanish flag was forbidden at the ceremony, Franco's grandson draped the coffin in a nationalist flag instead. It marked the final chapter of Spain's most controversial leader, whose legacy still divides the nation to this day, Augusto Pinochet. On the morning of December 3, 2006, Augusto Pinochet, Chile's former dictator, suffered a heart attack. His house arrest was immediately lifted, and just a week later, on December 10th, he was rushed to the intensive care unit. Within hours, Pinochet died from congestive heart failure and pulmonary edema. He was 91 years old, passing away in the military hospital of Santiago with his family by his side. The news sent shockwaves across Chile. In Santiago, thousands of people poured into the streets, some mourning his death, others openly celebrating it. His body was placed the following day at the military academy, where supporters could pay their respects. But even there, tensions erupted. Francisco Cuadra Prats, the grandson of a general murdered under Pinochet's regime, approached the coffin and spat on it, triggering a furious response from loyalists, who quickly attacked him. Mao Zedong. In the final years of his life, Mao Zedong's health was in steep decline. He was a heavy chain smoker, and behind the scenes the government worked hard to keep his condition a closely guarded secret. Mao was suffering from multiple serious illnesses, heart and lung problems, and possibly even Parkinson's or ALS, though those were never officially confirmed. By 1976, things became critical. He suffered a heart attack in March, another in late June, and a third massive attack on September 2nd that left him completely incapacitated. He never recovered. On September 9, 1976, Mao died at the age of 82. When his embalmed body was placed on display, over 1 million people filed past to pay their final respects. Mao had wished to be cremated, but his request was ignored. Instead, his body was permanently enshrined in a mausoleum, so the people of China could continue to honor him long after his passing. Fidel Castro. In the summer of 2006, Fidel Castro, the iconic face of the Cuban Revolution, fell gravely ill with intestinal bleeding and was forced to undergo emergency surgery. For the first time in decades, he temporarily handed over power to his brother, Raúl Castro. Over the following years, Fidel slowly withdrew from the daily affairs of government. By 2008, he officially stepped down, saying it wouldn't be right to hold a position that demanded more energy than he could give. Raúl became president, but always made sure Fidel's voice was heard on major decisions. Still, Fidel's health continued to fade. The government kept most details secret, though rumors circulated that he suffered from diverticulitis. What was clear to everyone was that he was growing weaker with each passing year. Finally, on the night of November 25, 2016, Fidel Castro died in Havana at the age of 90. The exact cause of death was never revealed. As a remarkable detail, throughout his long life, Castro had survived more than 600 assassination attempts. Adolf Hitler. By early 1945, Hitler's world was collapsing. The Soviet Red Army was advancing from the east, the Western Allies were closing in from the west, and Germany itself lay in ruins. Yet he refused to surrender. Instead, he clung to delusional hopes, dreaming of counterattacks in the Ardennes, or believing the US and Britain might turn against the Soviets after Roosevelt's death. But none of it came true. On April 20th, his 56th birthday, Hitler made one final appearance outside the bunker, awarding medals to teenage members of the Hitler Youth. It would be the last time he ever saw daylight. By April 23rd, Berlin was completely surrounded. Over the next week, he retreated to the Führer bunker, where reports from the front grew more catastrophic by the hour. His generals were disobeying orders, deserting, or, like Himmler and Goering, trying to negotiate surrender behind his back. Enraged, Hitler branded them traitors and stripped them of power. On the night of April 28th, he married his longtime companion, Eva Braun, in a brief civil ceremony. Just a day later, he learned that Mussolini had been captured and executed by Italian partisans. Determined not to meet the same fate, Hitler made his decision. On April 30th, as Soviet troops closed in just a few hundred meters away, he ended his life with a pistol shot to the head. Eva followed by biting into a cyanide capsule. Following his instructions, their bodies were carried into the garden, doused with gasoline, and set ablaze as Soviet artillery thundered overhead. Joseph Goebbels briefly assumed leadership, but he too chose death the very next day. On May 2nd, Berlin finally surrendered. Hitler's remains were later identified only through fragments of his dental records. It wasn't until 1956, over a decade later, that a German court officially issued his death certificate.